We've got Liberal Senator James Paterson joining me now because he's in the Senate, which is helpful. Welcome to the program.
Always helpful to have a senator, Patricia. Thank you for having me.
Always a smart strategy, get someone from the other house. So let's stick with you, because one of your colleagues in the party room really quizzed Greg Hunt on the rollout of the vaccine program and what's available from GP clinics, what they're being paid, whether they can administer Pfizer, some really key and I think very important questions. Are you concerned about the rollout and what incentives are being given to GPs and why that kind of lane is working so slowly?
Well, Patricia, I wasn't actually in party room this morning because it's Senate estimates this week. In any case, you would know I couldn't comment on that. But speaking more broadly about the issue, I think everybody in Australia, in Canberra, in the government included, wants the vaccine rollout to go as fast as possible while maintaining safety and confidence. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. And as Victorian, what I really welcome, what I thought was a really great innovation this week was lowering the age of eligibility in Victoria from to go to the 40 age bracket. And that's generated a terrific response. A lot of people in that age bracket have come forward. I think I saw you might have even come forward. I wouldn't speculate which age bracket you're in, but I saw you got your vaccine this week, and a lot of other people have, and that's a really important development that will help roll it out even faster. Yeah,
that's right. Early 40s, and I was first in the queue. Well, fifth, but I got up very early.
Well done.
Yeah. So, James, the government says the vaccine rollout wasn't a race. Why wasn't it? I mean, it should be a race, right?
I think we've got caught a little bit up in semantics and a bit of a word game here. I don't think it's really that important whether we call it a race or not a race. It's important we do it as quickly as possible, as safely as possible, because the sooner that we roll it out, the sooner we can return to something of a normal life that we used to have. The sooner we do that, the less likely it is we're going to need to go into lockdowns as we have again in Victoria. And the sooner we're going to be able to travel internationally and welcome international visitors again, which would be really positive for us as individuals and for our economy. So I'm someone who wants to see it happen as fast as possible, and that ambition that I have is shared widely across the parliament and in the government.
You must be alarmed then that only 30,000 out of a 300,000 strong workforce have been vaccinated. That's aged care workers.
Well, the good news is that the vaccine rollout pace is increasing. It's picked up quite a lot. The delivery of the first 2 million doses took about 60 days, and the delivery of the second 2 million doses took about 30 days, so almost double the pace. We're now at about 4.3 million doses administered. And of course, most of those are first doses, and in the case of AstraZeneca, there's a 3-month gap before you can have your second dose. So it will take some time before all those critical workers are fully vaccinated. But the good news is all of those who wanted to have it have had it made available to them by and large, and there's very few people who haven't had that choice and that opportunity made available to them.
30,000 out of 300,000, surely that's not good enough.
Well, I'd like it to go faster, Patricia, there's no doubt about that. And
so
I know
the government, I know you're not the responsible minister, but surely you're not happy with that pace. You couldn't possibly be happy with that pace.
Well, I want it to go as fast as possible and as safely as possible, Patricia, but we have a number of constraints, which you know. Well, let's talk about these constraints, right? So we didn't get as many AstraZeneca doses that we had originally planned because export was blocked from the European Union. And then we had the advice of ATAGI, the expert group on immunisation, which said that AstraZeneca should not be administered, is not recommended for under 50s. And so a lot of those critical workers are in that age category. And so Pfizer is the recommended vaccine for them. And of course, there's been constraints on Pfizer supply as well, partly because it doesn't have that same constraint that AstraZeneca has. The whole world is scrambling to get Pfizer. We've secured an enormous amount of doses, but a lot of those are arriving in the second half of the year. So there's been constraints, and there's also been some hesitancy. We've seen people who have been offered the vaccine not take that up. Happily, I think that is a smaller proportion of aged care workers and healthcare workers as far as we can tell so far, but we do want them to take that up if they're going to be interacting with vulnerable people.
The other statistic is this revelation that it's actually 21 aged care centres that haven't had the vaccine. That's residents. Are you alarmed by that? I mean, we are now at the start of winter.
The Minister, I think, acknowledged that he misread a brief on that, and that's the reason for that mix-up. But, I mean, he's human, and that can happen to all of us.
Yeah, I'm not quizzing you about the mistake he's made. I'm talking about the actual number. So we know it's 21 centres now. No vaccine in 21 centres. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I am concerned about aged care residents and workers having availability and access to the vaccine because we know they are vulnerable, and unfortunately we've seen in Victoria it has got back into at least one aged care home and we hope no others. But we do want to ensure that those workers and residents are vaccinated as soon as possible, as soon as we possibly can.
Okay, so, you know, ultimately we all know that aged care is a federal responsibility. That's on the federal government, isn't it? That's on the aged care minister and the health minister that 21 centres still don't have haven't had the vaccine rolled out.
Well, we're sharing the responsibility for the vaccine rollout with the states. We accept our share of the responsibility, absolutely, and we're doing everything we can in our power to make that available to as many Australians as possible.
But aged care is a federal responsibility.
Yes, and the vaccine rollout is a shared state and federal responsibility, and many aged care workers have quite appropriately chosen to go and get their vaccines through the state-based mass immunisation centres, and we encourage them to continue to do that if they haven't already.
You're a Victorian senator. Usually you're on a panel, so I'm just grilling you. Should the federal government provide financial support if that lockdown is extended beyond Friday?
The federal government's already provided record support to Victoria, about $46 billion of federal support, which contrasts to about $13 billion of direct support by the Victorian government. So almost 3 times as much support to Victorians than the Victorian government. So I don't think it's reasonable for anyone to complain about the generosity of that support. We have had other lockdowns since the end of JobKeeper, particularly in Western Australia and Queensland, where there was no request for and no need for JobKeeper or any other federal supports to be rolled out.
There are
they were shorter. And I was just going to acknowledge that, Patricia. They were shorter, and we would have hoped that this lockdown in Victoria would have been shorter as well. If the Victorian government decides that it wants to extend the lockdown and it makes a judgment that it's not confident that it can get on top of the challenge before then I think it's incumbent on the Victorian government from its resources to provide that support that might be necessary.
So if the lockdown is to go longer than the designated, 1 week, 7 days circuit breaker that they announced, why isn't it a federal responsibility? It's the federal government that deals with supporting workers. That's been the precedent in the past. Why does that shift all of a sudden?
Well, the federal government's supported not just workers, but businesses and universities and migrants and many, many, many groups of people in the community to make sure that we can get through this. There is a limit to how much federal taxpayers can be asked to bear, and it is the case that Victoria has had the most days in lockdown and the most number of lockdowns, and the Victorian government does have some responsibility to bear there. The Victorian government has the exact same capacity to, if it thinks it's necessary, to go and borrow money to support businesses and workers and others in the community. And I think we are getting to a point where asking the rest of Australia that hasn't had to go into all of these lockdowns repeatedly and for long periods to subsidise the failures that have occurred in Victoria is getting unreasonable.
Oh, well, I have to challenge you on that. How is this a failure? Well, how is it a failure in Victoria? It was actually a breach in a South Australian quarantine hotel.
Well, we know, Patricia, that there has been a failure in the contact tracing where that gentleman from South Australia was said to have gone to one Woolworths when in fact he'd gone to another, and that may have contributed to the missing link that now exists in the community. We don't know. We'll find out in due course. But the early period of the contact tracing did fail in this instance. OK,
but that's not what Professor Paul Kelly says. He said that he actually thinks the Victorian contact tracing system is working. So you're contesting the Chief Medical Officer's advice.
Well, Professor Kelly's being very diplomatic and very appropriate for a public health official to be focused on this. As a Victorian senator, now having seen my constituents endure their 4th lockdown, I don't think you can say it's just a coincidence that we've had all these lockdowns in Victoria and they've been the longest. The federal government is the same in every state and territory. What's different about Victoria is it has a different state government. And, I mean, they had a commission of inquiry into their own failures so that no one can argue that there haven't been dismal, serious failures.
Yeah, well, and last year there was a hotel quarantine bungle, absolutely well reported. This time it happened in South Australia, and the Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, tells us that the Victorian contact tracing system is working. And you're saying he's just being diplomatic. Are you saying he's not telling us the truth?
Well, what I'm saying is, Patricia, that other states have had lockdowns and other states have also got on top of outbreaks without lockdowns. And a very good example is the way the New South Wales government has handled these issues. It is a choice, a public policy choice, to go into lockdown. It is a contentious issue. Victoria has favoured lockdowns. New South Wales has been able to get on top of other leaks into the community from hotel quarantine, whether it came from their own hotel quarantine or quarantine in another state, without going to lockdown. And the Northern Beaches example is the best example of that. It was comparably serious to this one that we're having in Victoria, and yet they were able to get on top of it with contact tracing and other measures alone without going to lockdown. So it is a choice.
Okay, you say it's a choice, yet it's a different strain and a different scenario. I'm going to bring in Labor's Stephen Jones, because that division is over, and that's how we roll on this program when the politicians turn up. So, Stephen Jones, you've heard the criticism there, and pretty strong criticism, I've got to say, from Senator James Paterson from Victoria, saying that it's on the Victorian government. They've pulled this policy lever, this lockdown, and in fact New South Wales doesn't do it. What's your reaction to that?
Two things. Firstly, I can understand why James and others are very anxious to deflect responsibility away from themselves for their failure in standing up a quarantine system that was fit for purpose. We've had 12 months to do that. Failure, abject failure, haven't done it. And the failure of the vaccine rollout, described by health experts from my own region as a ticking time bomb that now looks like it's going to go off because they've failed in the rollout of the vaccine. So that's the first thing. I can understand why they want to deflect blame to everyone but themselves, but the fact is nobody's buying it. The fact is this is on them. Secondly, however, I mean, as far as the difference between how New South Wales and Victoria has handled this, if Victoria was presented with the same set of problems as New South Wales, where you had maybe a couple of dozen, maybe even up to 100 primary contacts, yeah, a limited restrictions as were applied over Christmas would be put into place. But you're looking at up to 10,000 primary contacts. And when you're faced with that sort of potential spread of the virus, regrettably, if you want to keep a lid on it, the sort of lockdowns that's put in place, and agreed by the Prime Minister, by the way. The Prime Minister said in question time last week, I agree with what the Victorian government has done. It is a sensible response to the health challenge that has been put in place. So maybe James disagrees with his own boss. I don't know. I can understand why they're trying to reflect and deflect blame for this, but it's actually not true and people aren't buying it.
Well, you know, everyone's obviously got a bit of a different analysis on this panel. James, I do want to ask you again. You say when that, you know, that situation arose in New South Wales that they didn't go to this broad lockdown. We've got this Indian strain and 10,000 people that have been asked to, you know, stand down. The numbers are different and the strain's different, isn't it?
Well, Patricia, to Stephen's point and to your point, how do you get to 10,000 primary contacts? New South Wales could have had 10,000 primary contacts as well if they hadn't got on top of it earlier with really effective public health response and contact tracing. Anyone can get to 10,000 primary contacts if you let it run, if you don't get on top of it early, if you have failures of contact tracing. And unfortunately in Victoria, maybe you could say this response to this lockdown was completely justified and perfectly understandable. Fair enough, I'm not contesting that, but this is the fourth time we've had a lockdown in Victoria, and there does seem to be something different about Victoria. It has locked down repeatedly, and it is now saying that it's the federal government's responsibility to bail it out from its multiple lockdowns, when in fact the federal government has done more than anyone else to support Victorians, $46 billion of support compared to just 13.
Well, you've heard that argument being put by a Victorian senator that the federal government shouldn't be bailing out Victoria. But Stephen, you think it is a federal government responsibility?
Can I go to that point? Firstly, there's been more federal government support go to New South Wales than Victoria. I don't begrudge a cent of that, not because I'm from New South Wales, but because I'm a member of the Australian Commonwealth. And one of the reasons we federated in the first place was to ensure that we could have the strength of a united Commonwealth, enabling us to deal with the challenges of a united Commonwealth. And nothing is a challenge like a pandemic, the one we're dealing with at the moment. try as you may, you can't get away from the fact that your vaccine rollout has failed and you haven't stood up a quarantine system which is fit for purpose. And that's the crux of the matter. That's why we've got this problem in aged care. That's why we've got this problem in Victoria at the moment, because you haven't stood up. This is all escape from hotel quarantine, which is, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think that hotel quarantine wasn't the right response 12 months ago. It was. When you needed to move quickly, absolutely, use the vacancies in hotels to stand up a quarantine system. But we're nearly 18 months down the road now, and we still have not put in place purpose-built quarantine services. It seems to me strange that if you want to bring a horse into the country, or a cat or a dog, they go into a Commonwealth-built, Commonwealth-run quarantine biosecurity centre. But if you want to bring a human being into the country, that's hotel quarantine. It's not a Commonwealth responsibility. That's bizarre.
Oh yeah, well, we're not cats and dogs
which you know,
here.
Which is, there's a very good reason for that. Stephen,
that's my point. We are not cats and dogs. We treat cats and dogs more importantly than we treat human beings. We have a greater risk
this
profile.
moment and confirm that we're not cats and dogs. And James, put another question to you, please. Let me before we say goodbye, which is, you are clearly concerned about the fourth lockdown or the sort of, multiple lockdowns in Victoria. If the Victorian government pulls the lever and says they need to go for longer with a lockdown, do you think that would be the wrong decision for the state?
I'm not going to preempt any decision that they might make, and I do not have access to the public health briefings that they will be making to base that decision on it. But what I do know is that Victorians have suffered too many lockdowns for too long, and the Victorian government has implicitly acknowledged their own responsibility in that by commissioning an inquiry into their own hotel quarantine failures last year, and it is having an enormous impact on Victorian citizens and small businesses who have suffered very much from this. And so if the Victorian government thinks that further lockdowns are necessary, it is incumbent on them to provide the necessary economic and financial supports that Victorians may need to get through it.
All right, we're out of time, but certainly a very live conversation. Thank you very much.